Wouldn't it be grand if people came with a user's manual? If we each had our own blueprint that mapped out how we're put together and described what it is that makes us tick? Even better, if it were to include a troubleshooting guide to assist us when things weren't going as expected. I think we can all agree that people are too complex for that. However, CBT tries to do something along those very same lines in order to develop tailored treatment plans and promote insight. It may take weeks to pull together using multiple data sources, but each CBT therapist collaboratively creates a case formulation and constantly revises it. Welcome to Lecture 3, where we'll build from assessment data to develop a narrative that explains an individual's condition and how to change it. We'll describe the links in a possible causal chain. We'll develop hypotheses that explain problems and situations using cognitions, behavior, emotions, relationships, and other social interactions. And we'll develop a treatment plan based on that formulation. But what's a formulation? Well, a case formulation is defined as an individualized theory that explains a particular patient's symptoms and problems, serves as a basis for an individual treatment plan, and guides the therapy process. This classic definition, taken from Jackie Person's 1989 classic book, Cognitive Therapy in Practice, a case formulation approach. With this case formulation, we'll be compiling and interpreting data. We'll use data from self-report, from surveys, from observations of the patient in action, or from interviews or reports from significant others. We'll also use data taken from behavioral analysis. We'll look at the antecedents of the behavior itself, and the consequences that follow. Our interventions will flow from the formulation. It's important to remember, though, that you can formulate a case or a patient as a whole. You can formulate a problem like depression or anxiety, or you can create a formulation based on a very specific situation. Now, the word formula can be misleading, but we're looking at how key ingredients combine to create an individual's current life circumstances. It's not really about blame, it's more about trying to understand the causes so that you can prescribe a treatment. Now, we could just use a standard treatment protocol. There are fantastic treatment manuals that are out there, a sort of one-size-fits-all approach. But we know that everyone is different. We need to take into account different contextual or environmental or family factors. We need to take into account potential comorbidities, either psychiatric, medical, or otherwise. And of course, we want to take into account an individual's specific goals. Now, some of the notable features of a formulation is that it's always a work in progress. It is shared with the patient who helps to revise it. We'll go about hypothesis testing using the formulation, and we'll either prove or disprove particular parts of it. For the parts that prove not to be accurate, we'll change it. Our hypotheses are about psychological mechanisms and other factors that cause or maintain the disorder or the other problems that brought an individual to treatment. But what are the key elements of a case formulation? First, we're going to start with something called the problem list and a diagnosis. Second, we want to develop those working hypotheses, and I think there are 4 important components to remember when creating a working hypothesis. First, you want to look at the role of cognition, and especially deeper cognitive structures, something called schemas or scripts, and we're going to talk a little bit about Beck's cognitive model. The second part of a working hypothesis, we'll look at behaviors, and here again we'll look at those antecedents or triggers. We'll look at the punishments and the rewards that a particular behavior evokes. Third, we'll want to look at the origins, and here we're talking about early learning events, or we might be talking about your parents or family of origin issues. And lastly, we'll tie it all together and create a summary to tell a story. Now, the third key element of an overall case formulation, you want to focus in on an individual's strengths and assets. Yes, it was probably suffering or a problem that brought them to therapy in the first place, but they also have strengths and assets that we might be able to tap into. And fourth, we want to create a treatment plan. So given what we know about the person, given our hypotheses, the strengths and the assets, what are our goals, what are our measures, and what are the interventions that we're going to use? So let's look at each of those components. The first was a problem list or diagnosis. Now, in a medical setting, they would call this the chief complaint or the presenting complaint. Patient presents with pain, patient presents with depression or anxiety, but we want to go a little bit further than that, and we want to include other domains. So we want to cast a wide net in terms of other psychological issues or maybe psychiatric disorders. We want to look at interpersonal issues of social supports or social conflicts. We want to look at something called occupational functioning. So how well are you doing at work? What are your successes? What are your failures? We'll want to include potential medical diagnoses or medical concerns or symptoms. It might include finances, housing, legal issues. It might also include basic quality of life and enjoyment. Once we have a full list created, it needs to be ranked. Of course, we're going to put things like suicide or violence or any emergent type issues up at the top of our list, but we'll also want to look for something called therapy interfering behaviors. So if I know that a patient has a habit of skipping their sessions, I'm going to address that problem first, because if I can't get them in, we can't really help them. For our case of Maria, her problem list would include things like her social stressors, her husband or caregiving for her husband, her relationship with her daughters and friends and maintaining that relationship, maybe her finances. Mood and emotional problems would include depression, stress, worry, and anxiety. And she's mentioned a couple of different physical symptoms, her difficulty with sleep, her chronic pain, especially from her osteoarthritis, and she's having frequent upper respiratory tract infections. We know that her diagnosis is major or clinical depression. Now, for Michael, his problem lists and diagnoses are different. His social stressors include conflict with both his son and his wife, conflict with coworkers, rejection from his friends and his neighbors. Physical and medical problems include his cardiovascular disease, his high blood pressure, his high cholesterol. We know emotionally he has a problem with rapid onset, intense anger, and he sometimes has difficulty in regulating his behavioral responses to his anger. And his diagnosis? Well, he doesn't have a psychiatric diagnosis, at least not yet. So the next step would be building that working hypothesis. And how could we go about doing that? We want to look for explanations as to why a particular problem exists, or we want to look at an individual's reaction to a particular situation and try to understand why they've reacted in that particular way. What caused it, or what causes it? What maintains the problem? What makes the problem worse, or what makes the problem better? We want to remember that there might be both internal factors as well as external factors. Now, I want you to recall when we talked with Carol about the CBT triangle. Now, we're going to focus on cognitions and behaviors and emotions, but we should remember that biology may be exerting an influence too, so that might be on our map or our formulation as well. Now, as I mentioned with the working hypothesis, there are 4 components. We talk about cognition, or especially schemas using Beck's model. We'll talk about behaviors. We talk about early origins, and then we tie it all together to tell a summary. So let's look at the first part, Beck's cognitive theory. So the general assumption is that events make us think or feel a certain way. My boss made me angry. My significant other makes me stressed out. We may acknowledge that we have a choice in how we react, but we often see it as a direct cause and effect relationship. Now, Beck's cognitive theory has a different model, and this really takes us back to the Greek and Stoic philosophers who tell us that it isn't events that trouble us, but it's the view we take of those events. So in the cognitive model, we have an activating event which triggers cognitions, or what are called automatic thoughts, which then cause emotional and behavioral consequences. Now, particular kinds of automatic thoughts are linked to specific reactions. For example, with anger, it tends to be preceded by thoughts of, I'm being mistreated, or there's some sort of injustice that has occurred. For depression, it's often thoughts about loss. But you might want to ask, well, why did we have those particular automatic thoughts? 2 people in exactly the same situation may have dramatically different automatic thoughts. To answer that question, we'll have to use Beck's model to drill down a little bit deeper into our belief system. We'll need to better understand our rules of life, or what are called our conditional if-then assumptions, and we'll need to look at what Beck called schemas or scripts that tell us what to expect, how to react, and how to live our lives. Ultimately, we'll boil it down to our basic beliefs or core beliefs about ourselves, about others, and about the world. Let's move to watch our first video clip where we're talking with Michael about how to set up a formulation, and we begin to connect the dots. Okay, Michael, why don't we take a step back and let's revisit what we had talked about a few times ago. And I wanted us to talk about a case formulation. And formulation is kind of a formal term, and we can't reduce a person to a formula, obviously. But we've been gathering stories from you, and you've been great in doing your homework and helping us understand what are the common thoughts, behaviors, and emotions that you have around anger. And this is our opportunity to start chaining them together to see sort of what are some of those habits maybe that sort of sit inside you that we can pull out and understand and maybe change.
Okay.
Okay? And what a formulation tends to have in it, we've talked a bit about automatic thoughts, and in the ABC we call them beliefs. So these are the sort of surface situational thoughts. Guy takes your parking place and thoughts pop to mind. Your wife walks out and catches you smoking out on the deck and certain thoughts pop to mind. And a lot of those thoughts were things like, this is unjust, unfair, not right. They all kind of fell into that category. And you had lots of different kinds of events, and some of them triggered sadness and some were happiness, but the anger ones, many of them had that sort of automatic thought. Mm-hmm. What a formulation does is it starts drilling sort of down to get a little more deep. They call those automatic because they just pop to mind uninvited, but oftentimes they flit in and they flit out and they're not terribly substantial. Sometimes they are, but not always. So a little bit deeper than that, those out of all the world of possible automatic thoughts, you had this one. So it must come from somewhere. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's a prior life experience. Maybe it's the way you see the world. Maybe it's the alignment of the stars. I mean, who knows, right? But there's reasons. There's reasons why it happens. So in cognitive therapy, we look at the automatic thoughts, but then we also want to look at things like, I'll call this one conditional assumptions. And sometimes they call them schemas. It's almost like having a script of the way things should be, and that would definitely relate to your perception of what's just or unjust. You have this pre-existing belief of what is right and what is wrong. And belief underneath the conditional assumptions and schemas are something called core beliefs. So some would even argue that sort of in your heart or your head or your belly or wherever you want to say, sort of deep inside you, there are some really basic thoughts that we often learned very early on about our worth, about the world, and about what other people are like. And we want to start sort of filling these in. Now, this is a work in progress. It's always open to revision, and I hope it's a living document that we can keep revising. But let's see if we can come up with just a few examples. So we have lots of automatic thoughts from like the ABC homework that you did before. A conditional assumption would be like, and I've heard you make a few of them before. So in the guy that took your parking space at the gym, and that I know that was a little while ago, but you'd said something like, if I let him get away with this, then he won't be punished, or in the way of the universe, it's not fair for him to not have some sort of punishment for. So it sounds like there's a rule there. Can you put that into your words for me?
People should be responsible and held responsible for their actions.
Okay. People should be held responsible. And I'll just put a ... And what does that mean, held responsible?
If I'm at work and one of my senior supervisors asks me to do something, I am taking on a responsibility when I say, yes, I'll do that. And I should then follow through. If I don't follow through, I need to be held responsible. Mm-hmm. And there need to be consequences for that. Mm-hmm. So there is a contract, I guess, in the way that we all interact. Mm-hmm. You use the example of the parking space. To my mind, the contract is if I'm there first and I'll get my blinkers on, that's my spot. Right. And he's not upholding his end of the contract. Just as if I didn't do what my supervisor expected me to do, I'm breaking the rules. I'm breaking that contract.
Okay. So there's something about, and I'll just put it into words, so social contracts should not be broken. And if they are broken, then what? If
there should be consequences. Now, I don't know that. I don't know what those consequences always should be, but I just feel that there should be consequences. Right. Whether it's, in my case, I'm reprimanded, or I have to work the weekend, extra hours. I would understand that those are the consequences for breaking my social contract, as you called it here.
Now, they call these conditional assumptions because they're often written like if-then statements. So if a social contract is broken, then there must be consequences. Or earlier when you were talking about work, you said if I agree to a particular project, then I should be held accountable for that. And if you don't follow through, if I don't follow through with that obligation, then I should receive some sort of negative consequence. So that's a lot of rules, like if then. And, you know, the world needs rules, right? We have civilized society, there has to be rules. But what we want to look at is sort of what's your set of conditional assumptions? Is there an element of flexibility or context specificity? Or are they pretty hard, fast, regardless, applied uniformly across the board?
Well, I suppose that in the case of the driver, the jerk I've called him in the past, if I were to find out that he really was in a hurry, someone in the building that he knew he had been called to the scene and there was an emergency, then that would be one of those kinds of circumstances that makes me not be so rigid about the consequences.
Okay.
If I, as an employee, am asked to do something and I become very ill and I can't deliver, that would be a circumstance.
So I'll just put if circumstances, then there needs to be some sort of flexibility.
That's fair. That's fair.
Okay. Okay. And I guess the challenge then is knowing this when there's circumstances and knowing how much to flex.
I suppose in the case of the fellow in the car, that sarcastic wave suggested to me that there were no circumstances like this, but that makes a lot of sense to me. That way.
Sure. Okay. Now, when we were setting goals and we were writing out your problem list, anger was definitely up at the top, and we talked about how it affects relationships, both at work and also with your wife and kid and even extended family. But there was another element that was there too, and you talked about work stress and there's a lot of pressure on you. And it seemed like, and we talked a little bit, although not much, that you have a perfectionistic streak, that you have really high standards, you expect yourself to be 110% of the time, pretty much. Is that fair to?
I think that's the way I am.
Okay. Now, if we were going to put that into some sort of a conditional assumption or schema, so what would that sound like? What would that look like?
If I'm doing my best, people should recognize that.
Okay. So if I do my best, then recognition. Okay. Michael and I go on to elicit a number of additional conditional assumptions. Then we move on to discuss the deepest levels of all, schemas and core beliefs. Let's watch this next clip. So what we'll want to do as we move forward is we'll keep hearing about stories, we'll keep pulling out beliefs, automatic thoughts, but I want to start a little bit and have us think about some of the core beliefs. Now, the core beliefs, it's really sort of a simple idea of there's really sort of two things that sit in our core, and it's really about self-worth, and oftentimes it's about that sense of self-worth of who you are, the coin of which you're made. It drives our beliefs we have about the world. It drives our automatic thoughts and our relationships at home and at work.
Okay.
And there's kind of two big buckets, and one is about your level of lovability, to put it simply, and the other is about your level of success. So one is really about, am I a successful person, defined however you want. And the other is about relationships and connection and intimacy. And am I someone that's made of the stuff that other people will love? And for people who are depressed, they often have the thought that they're not lovable and that they're a failure. And they feel really lousy about it. But I don't, what would you guess your beliefs are in terms of lovability or success?
Well, I feel that I'm successful on my own terms, and that is I expect a lot of myself, and I think that I typically deliver. So in that sense, I would expect that others would look at him professionally, say, he's successful. Lovable, that's maybe another matter.
Okay.
It's hard to know what people think of you. I think that generally my heart's in the right place, but maybe I don't express that in a way that people can really grab onto and say, that's a likable or a lovable fellow. I guess I never really have thought about it all that much. If I thought about it a lot and I feel I'm not lovable, then maybe it would depress me, but I don't feel that way really.
Yeah.
But I can see how maybe lovable isn't the word you'd naturally attach to my personality.
Okay. And that's important to know and to maybe to think about. And I think people's value systems sometimes value success more than lovability, or vice versa. You know, there's no one right way to be. It's just different. But the other part of lovability isn't just, are you lovable to other people? It's, do you love yourself? Do you care about yourself? At the end of the day, when all is said and done, are you happy with who you are?
I would say probably not.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Well, I mean, part of it is what motivates me to talk to my wife and see what concerns her, and out of those conversations and out of the sense of yeah, maybe my anger is getting out of control, and even its physical ramifications and the way it manifested itself in the past, just in terms of my physical health, the way I feel, that's driven me here. And I guess, no slam on you, but if I really were feeling that I like myself at the end of the day, maybe I wouldn't be here talking to you.
Right. You're right. You're right.
But certainly, setting this conversation and this context aside, my anger seems to be arising out of almost a dissatisfaction. And I like to say it's a dissatisfaction with things out there, but really maybe it's a dissatisfaction with my inability to control the things out there. And so I want to be in control. I like a guy who's in control. And if I'm not in control, maybe I don't like myself so much. Does that make any sense?
Mm-hmm. Makes a lot of sense. And sounds like you have a working hypothesis about what's driving some of this behavior, that at core you have this dissatisfaction with who you are, or maybe the way you behave. Sometimes it's not in line with your values. You told me about your charity work, you told me how much you love your family, and sometimes it's not evident that that's the person that you actually are. That you have a fear of not being in control and feel like you have to control things in order to be successful, in order to be lovable, in order to protect yourself or protect your family.
Yeah.
So why don't we pause for now with the formulation, but I would encourage you to think a little bit in your journal, and maybe even to reflect or write a little bit about this idea of lovability and control, and exactly what it is that you need to do to feel comfortable in your own skin. And maybe the possibility that sometimes all this stuff about injustice and unfairness isn't really about that. Maybe it's about sort of your sense of self and what you think you're made of, and your sense of control or power in the world.
That's food for thought.
So for Michael, we want to formulate anger. Now, our formulation will be part cognitive theory, those kinds of thoughts that tend to precede anger, but we're also going to use real-world data from Michael's life. We want to think about those cognitive themes that precede anger, but again, we want to make it relevant and salient for him using examples from his life. We'll also want to look at behaviors, and for him, we'll want to look at behaviors in at least a couple of different ways. The most obvious, we will want to look at the ways that he responds to his anger. Does he act on those impulses and act out his anger with other people? And if so, how do others respond? However, we're also going to look at what are the antecedents. So what are those things that trigger his anger in the first place? And it's possible that he may be making behavioral choices that puts him in high-risk situations for triggering his anger. But remember, this is cognitive behavioral therapy, and thus far we've mostly focused on emotions and cognition. That leaves a fairly large area unexplored. We'll dig deeper into behavior and behavioral activation in our depression lecture, but let me for now define behavior broadly and why it would matter in terms of a formulation. So for behavior, we cast a fairly wide net, and here we're talking about all sorts of activities, mundane, big activities, small activities, activities we do alone, activities we do with others. It would include activities for pleasure as well as activities for work, the things you have to do and the things that we want to do. The idea is that these activities throughout the course of the day are summative in terms of how they affect our mood. A lot of little activities can add up into a fairly profound effect. Now, the roots of the behavioral part of the formulation are from behaviorism and behavioral theory, where it talks about how rewards and punishments from our environment subtly shift our behaviors until sometimes they can create very complex, functional or maybe dysfunctional behaviors. Of course, we would also want to do self-monitoring with cognitions and emotions. We would want to do self-monitoring for behaviors as well. Now, lastly, for our hypothesis, we want to look at origins. So here we would start delving into the past. We want a broad picture first, and we won't spend probably substantial time going back unless we feel that we're stuck in the present and not able to make progress. So for Michael, we might look at his history of anger at work at home, his attempts to change, the role of anger in his family of origin. We'll weave all of these together into our hypotheses to tell a story. Now, an actual case formulation can run between 7 to 10 pages and typically includes all of the assessment data, the SMART goals, and treatment plans. So for Michael, I'll just share a little bit of his narrative, and it goes something like this. Michael is a 50-year-old married man with one teenage son, educated and gainfully employed. He's motivated to address his anger and sees how it will help him and others. He's uncertain if treatment can help, but he's willing to try. His anger has a quick onset and high intensity, but often a short duration. This pattern of angry arousal has been mostly lifelong and is similar to the pattern displayed by his own father, much to Michael's chagrin. His anger is triggered by any number of environmental events, usually involving a perceived transgression. The combination of his perfectionism and his hyper-responsibility, he must be the enforcer, further fuels his anger and his sense of self-righteousness, all in accord with the traditional cognitive model of anger. Michael doubts his own power and influence and often underestimates the effect he has on others. He worries that he and others won't learn or improve as human beings unless a punitive force keeps us in line. He clearly possesses some self-regulatory capacity as he's been in a successful marriage and has been promoted and successful at work. His anger has damaged and sometimes ended relationships and damaged his reputation. He's currently using exercise and self-help as a means to improve his anger control. He's interested in somatic quieting, deepening his empathy, and using classic cognitive behavioral therapy. Now remember, the last couple of parts of our case formulation include looking at strengths and assets. So for Michael, a strength is certainly his insight and his motivation, his love and value of his relationship with his wife and his son. He is gainfully employed, so doesn't have financial stressors, and his cardiovascular disease might actually be an asset because it helps to raise his motivation to control his anger. The last part of our formulation would be the treatment plan, and here we want to look at evidence-based treatments, but we also want to look at a patient's willingness to engage in those treatments and what the patient preferences might be. Now, for Maria, we're going to use the cognitive model for depression, where we'll look at a different family of cognitions and behaviors. We'll also use the model for stress and coping, and we'll want to look at her beliefs about her need to do it all and her difficulty in asking for help. We're going to need to look at her rising and profound grief and her sense of loss, her beliefs about suffering and her personal strengths and values. And her treatment ultimately will probably be mostly focused on depression, but will include elements of stress management as well as coping with loss. Now for Carol, we'll use a classic CBT model for anxiety, where it talks about the perception or misperception of threat, coupled with an estimation of having deficient coping resources. We want to help her look at her self-image, and I'm curious to see if maybe there's a little bit of depression or early life events underneath that might help us to understand why she's so socially anxious. We want to know her thoughts about herself, others, and the world. Next, I'd like to move to a frequently asked question. And a question from this individual says, do you always share a formulation with a patient? What if you share it and the patient thinks you're wrong? Well, the short answer is yes. We almost always share a formulation with a patient. In fact, it's seen as a collaborative process. And if the patient tells me that that formulation is wrong, well, I assume that it's wrong. And we need to roll up our sleeves, we need to go back to our data, and we need to rewrite that formulation. Really, by definition, it's always a work in progress, and it's always an iterative process. That formulation guides our treatment, and if we don't have the formulation right, we might not have the treatment right. Now, in our next lecture, we're going to talk about emerging therapies that fall into what's called CBT's third wave. Thank you.